Hello and good morning, everyone. I hope you all are fit and healthy. You all are taking all precautions. Welcome back to English with Aisha Siddiqui. We will be doing a topic from the SYBA book, that is the Special English book. And the topic is poetry, not only the second year BA students, but it is a universal topic, that is poetry. And today's topic, we'll be doing poetry over ages. What do you mean by poetry over ages? Does not mean that the poetry are getting older and there are new birthdays of the poetries. I'm so sorry for the silly jokes, but poetry over ages actually means that we will be learning about the history of poetries in which part of the year or which years the different poetries got introduced to us, to the English literature language, and who were the poets at that time. It is a very important topic as we need to know the authors and the way of poetry that they did, because it really comes in your examinations about the history of poetry. So quickly, without wasting time, it's not a very big topic. It's a very short topic with few subtopics in it. So we'll be starting right now. So, what is poetry over ages? Now, if you can see, this is actually the page of the book that I'm referring to. I have already shown this book many times, and this book is of second year BA students. An anthology of English poetry, a special English book, and I'm on page number 9, and I'm doing the topic poetry over ages that starts from here. And it's a short topic where we will be discussing all the ages of poetries, where and when, which year, which poetries were released and introduced. So let's start. The first one, poetry over ages. First of all, let's see what's the introduction to it. Western poetry is usually studied with three broad periods in mind. Which are the three periods of poetry? It's the ancient period, the medieval period, and the modern period. Ancient, everyone knows the very old period, that means when poetry actually started. So that is known as poetry over ages. That means the first poetry that was introduced was in the ancient period. Then comes in the medieval period, that's the middle period, and then the modern period that is continuing till right up till now. So, and then we will all now highlight the significance of development of in the art of poetry during each period. That means during all the three periods, we will be seeing the art of poetry. Let's start with the first one, ancient poetry. By ancient poetry, we mean classical Greek and Latin poetry. What do you mean by classical Greek and Latin? Now, everyone knows poetry was actually introduced long time back, where the first types of poetry was the Greek and Latin poetries, and then it was converted into English languages, and later on, even English language poetries got introduced. Then the two great masterpieces of Western literature is the Iliad and Odyssey were written during this period. These two great poetries, very well known masterpieces, were written during this time. These two works have subsequently been an infinite source of inspiration to poets and writers of all ages. So these were the two poetries, and the authors of these two poetries were actually up to date till now. All the poets and authors, they are their ideal, and they actually refer to their poetry, and then they write their own poetry, and it is actually a source of information and inspiration for us even till now when it comes to poetry. So, of course, you all should know all these two names of the poetry that is given here, Odyssey and Iliad, the two masterpieces, very important. And then, supposedly written by a blind poet, the two epic deal with the lives of the heroes of the Trojan War. Now, who wrote it? It was supposedly written by, means it is through many information, it is written by a blind poet. So you can imagine a blind poet who could not see has written these two masterpieces that are till now up to date. They're famous and they're inspired by many other poets. And the blind poet, the name of the poet was Homer, and these two epics. Now, we've done many kinds of poetries and elements of poetries. For the ones who have not seen kinds of poetries, elements of poetries, you can go back to the channel and watch the previous videos of mine, wherein I have uploaded videos on what is poetry, types of poetry, kinds of poetry, categories, elements, why and how a poetry is written. So it can be a great help for the second year students and also at large where poetry is being learned. And this can help you in your examination because I have also done the question answer rounds of it. So you all can go back and watch those videos. Now let's come to the other part of poetry, that is medieval poetry. The medieval poetry, also known as Middle Ages. So the name itself refers medieval, and the name is, I mean, the word refers to it as middle. Began in the 4th century AD. It witnessed the rise of Christian church. So of course, if it's just after Jesus Christ. So too much there was written about Jesus Christ and Christian churches, and it witnessed a rise in it. So the feudal structure of society combined with the universal influence of the church. So everyone got influenced by the church, and also there were many poetries written on the topic of it, left no room for the assertion of individual personality. Now, this got so famous at that time, that is the Christian church, that poetries were only written on that topic, and there was no room for individual personality. That means not written on one or two person. At a whole, it was written on Christianity and Christian church. So, no wonder then much medieval literature is anonymous. That means no wonder that in the medieval age, everything was written about, about the Christian church, Jesus Christ, and all. The first great masterpiece of this period in British literary history is the epic. What do you mean by that? Again, I'm asking you all, it's a kind request. You all should know what you mean by epic. I have already explained you all in many videos, and there'll be upcoming videos on it as well. So, what is that? Beowulf was the name which was very famous in medieval. Between 675 and 850 AD, several lyric and poems were also written during this period. Not only poetries, even lyrical songs and hymns were written on it. So this period is also to be noted for vernacular forms of religious, narrative, and allegorical poetry. Now, allegorical poetry, lyrical poetry, I will be doing it in the upcoming videos. You all will even learn about them. Very important topic. It can come in your examinations. So we will be doing about them in the upcoming videos. Then, these early writers responded primarily to French, Italian, and classical literature. So, French, Greek, Italian, it was mostly introduced in these languages. Later on, it came into English language as well. In Italy, in between 1304 and 1374, one of the greatest figure in the Western poetry perfected the sonnet form. So now we know in the medieval period, at the end of medieval period, sonnet was introduced. So what is sonnet? You all should really know about it because there are many sonnets going to come in this book later on in the second year BA students. You all should really know about what is sonnet, what is epic, what is allegorical poem. The whole book is going to be dependent on that. So if you all have not seen, there are some videos that I've already posted, and there'll be many more going to come on allegorical poetry, lyrical poetry, and many more poetries. So please be in tune and keep watching videos wherein I'll be uploading all of these information. Let's go to the third part of poetry. That is Renaissance poetry. What do you mean by Renaissance? Now, in history, people who have done history who have not even done history as a specialized subject, but you all have done it in school. So you all will be knowing what is a Renaissance period, right? And what do you mean by Renaissance poetry? So with the Renaissance in the 15th century, we enter a new age. Renaissance means a new age in history of Western literature. The period saw the rebirth of interest of classical Greek and Roman. So by the end of medieval period, mostly poetries were going very down, like you can say a flop. But again, in the new period, they got a very high or a peak of poetry. Uh, in the Greek and Roman culture. The impact of the Renaissance appears in England at the close of 16th century. The 16th century culminating the Elizabethan period. Now everyone knows who's Queen Elizabeth, right? So that was the Renaissance period was very well known with the name of Queen Elizabeth. That is the Elizabethan period, which takes its name from Queen Elizabeth, who ascended the throne in 1558. So she was the queen at that time. Produced a very great flowering of poetry. So she loved poetry, and therefore poetry took a very great peak at that time because of Queen Elizabeth, and she was personally interested in it. The period gave to readers of poetry such gains of William Shakespeare. So here comes William Shakespeare. In the Renaissance, that is in the new period, William Shakespeare was the greatest writer and poet. He is also known as the national poet of London, I mean UK. So it's a very important information. Very few of people know that William Shakespeare was also known as the national poet, and you all can be asked questions related to it. So, Edmund Spenser, Sir Philip Sidney, again a very important poet and writer. That is Sir Philip Sidney. We are going to do a lot of poetry of Sir Philip also. In fact, the first poetry in our book of second year, that is the book that we are referring this one, the first poet itself is of Sir Philip Sidney, that is the Nightingale or the Philomela. So that's the first poetry. So you should know his name. And Christopher Marlowe. The age was one of the high ideals, and it was a period of intense literacy. Intense literacy means literature was on a peak at this time. This anthology featured some of the important work of Shakespeare, Spenser, and Sidney took place. So Shakespeare, Sir Philip Sidney, Christopher, all these were very well-known poets at that time, and they took a lot of peak during this age. The Renaissance saw the first important collection of English lyric poetries, such as you can see Tottle's Miscellany, then the sonnet, the most popular Elizabethan lyric form, sonnet. So it was named after Queen Elizabeth. She was very fond of sonnets, and sonnet is a 14-line small little poem or a song, you can say. We will be doing a topic of sonnet again later on. Then was introduced into England early in the 16th century by Sir Thomas Watt. His friend Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, is credited with the invention of blank verse and with fixing the rhyme scheme in a sonnet. Now you will know in the Renaissance period, that is the sonnet was introduced. In sonnet, how the rhyme scheme should be was introduced ages back, that we are still following. That the rhyme scheme should be A B A B C D C D E F E F G G. This is the rhyme scheme, a typical perfect rhyme scheme of sonnet. Up to date, we are actually referring to the same rhyme scheme that was done in the Renaissance period by the Elizabeth lyric form poetries, that is very popular for sonnet. and blank verse. We will be doing a topic of blank verse in the coming videos as well. Now, let's come to the other one, metaphysical poetry. What do you mean by metaphysical poetry? John Donne, Henry King, George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Andrew Marshall, and Henry Vaughan. Please, it's a kind request. You should know all the names of authors if you are doing literature. Learn them, memorize them, but keep it in your mind. John Donne, Henry King, George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Andrew Marshall, Henry Vaughan. So there are many more, but these are very few. These are very important ones at the time of metaphysical poetry. So these are the names that come to my mind. One contemplates and traditions of metaphysical poetry in the 17th century England. So whenever we talk about metaphysical poetries, these are the poets that come to mind. What do you mean by metaphysical? Metaphysical was applied to these poets by John Dryden and Samuel Johnson in order to indicate their poems somehow appeared unnatural. Now, their poetry was actually known as very unnatural poetry, and that's why they introduced this metaphysical part of the poetry. John Donne, the most brilliant poems, somehow, sorry, John Donne, the most brilliant of them all, developed an original poetic style, uniting thought and feelings. So now his poetry is, I mean, at this time of metaphysical poetry, the metaphysical poetry was introduced only because all the other poetries were known as very unnatural poetries. So the very best poet amongst them, what did he do? He removed a new part of poetry, I mean, a very new original poetic style, and he united thoughts and feelings together. Now, before it was only emotions and emotions, but here thoughts and feelings, he combined it and together it was known as metaphysical. So you can say as mental and physical combination together. That's why it's known as metaphysical. His philosophical and spiritual poems are also known for their acute psychological analysis and sexual realism. So he joined both of them, and he was very well known for psychological analysis as why a person thinks so. And today, up to date, we are learning psychology, and psychology is based on many of his writings as well, and also sexual realism. At this time, it's very important for everyone to bring in mind what is sexual realism, and we should not discriminate between both the sexes, etc. Everyone knows about it, so it was him who brought into notice about all this by his poetries. His holy sonnets dwell on divinity and mortality and contain some of his memorable poems. So, just let's see which were his memorable poems. Death, be not proud and batter my heart. Free person God, which is featured in this anthology. Okay, irony and paradox abounded his poem. Now, what do you mean by irony? What do you mean by paradox? Will be coming up in the coming videos. All these topics will be covered, so you should stay tuned for that. Now, let's move forward to the other type of poetry, that is neoclassical poetry. What do you mean by neoclassical poetry? The greatest English poet in the early years of the 17th century was John Milton, that acclaimed for such poems by Lycidas, Paradise Lost, Samson Agonistes, one of the greatest epic poems in world literature. Milton's masterpiece, Paradise Lost, deals with a biblical theme. What do you mean by biblical? So it actually depends on the story of Bible, the holy book of Christians. So it depends on that, the fall of man. How did man err when he was given back to earth, and what did he do at that time? So it is all written based on the story and the theme of Bible. It narrates in softy language Satan's temptation to Adam and Eve, and their expulsion from Eden. Some of his well known poems include On the Morning of Christ's Nativity on Shakespeare. Now, his poem included the story that is written in Bible, that is how did the Satan, that is the evil, how did he actually come to Adam and Eve, and how did he actually distract them from their path, and he removed them from the heaven, and right here on the earth was a result of their mistake because they came into the words of the Satan. So neoclassical is actually a classical type of story that is, you can say, religious stories. Let's see what is romantic poetry. Everyone knows what is romance, right? I don't feel that uh, any of you who's watching here will does not know the name romance, and everyone watches movies, so all of them know that romantic movies, if you'll watch, the first word that comes to your mind is Shah Rukh Khan. So let's see who's the hero of the romantic poetry, not the romantic movie. So Romanticism is one of the greatest literary movements of Western poetry. In Britain, as mentioned before, Wordsworth and Coleridge together brought out the lyrical ballads, the first major work of English Romanticism. So very, very well known poet, that is William Wordsworth, came into this time and he brought the romantic poetries along with Coleridge. So they both together brought lyrical ballads. Now we'll do later on what do you mean by lyrical ballads. And Wordsworth explains, in spite of difference of soil and climate, of language and manners, of laws and customs, in spite of things silently gone out of mind and things violently destroyed, the poet binds together. What do you mean by that? The poet binds together, so he brings all these, this purpose of life. So in you all are the second year students, right? You all must have done the first year of optional English, wherein you have a poetry of the world is too much with us. What do you mean by the world is too much with us? It's written by Wordsworth, wherein he has explained all emotions, that how the world is now getting attached to materialistic things and not towards nature. So this is how he brought a romanticism. Romantic does not only mean that romance between a girl and a boy. It can come into many more forms, and he brought this form that how a human should be attached to nature. It's a God gifted thing to humans, that is nature. Now let's see poetry after the 1850s. That is, we've come to the last part of the poetry over ages. The second half of the 19th century saw a number of social and political developments. So here politics developed and people started having a social life. Notable the Industrial Revolution. So as people got a little more settled, so it was known as the Industrial Revolution, which left their impact on poets. Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate of the Victorian era, and Robert Browning. Now, Robert Browning is another very well known poet, and you will be also having in the next semester, that is semester 4, the first poetry is My Last Duchess by Robert Browning. So, this poet you need to remember and his work as well, because you are going to get these poetries in your book in the upcoming semester. The master of the dramatic monologue. So Robert Browning was a master of dramatic monologue. What do you mean by dramatic monologue? Yes, all of this will be covered in the coming videos. These are the two towering figures of this age. Who are the two? Robert Browning, Alfred Lord Tennyson. These poets were the towering figures of the age in poetry after the 1850s. Thomas Hardy, a major novelist of the period, won recognition for his verse drama, The Dynasts. I hope you all must have read this. It's a really good book. Browning's wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, what did she do? George Meredith and Dante Gabriel composed sonnets during this period. So not only Robert Browning, but his wife also, she introduced sonnets in this period. So I hope you all, we cover up a lot of things that was required in poetry over ages. We actually cover up all the ages, the Renaissances, and just a minute. Yes, we cover up the ancient poetry, the medieval poetry, then Renaissance poetry, metaphysical poetry, neoclassical poetry, romantic poetry, poetry after 1850s. So there are seven poetries that we covered. I mean, seven ages that we covered up to the 19th and the industrialized revolution age. So almost before our time, we've covered all the ages of poetry. So it's a very important topic for you all to know who. Why is the purpose? What is the purpose that we are doing this poetry over ages? We should only know the names of the authors and what is their work. If we are going to study further the poetries of the book, we need to know who are the authors who write poets and who are the poets and authors and who are very well known, in which period they were well known, and also their work. This is the only purpose to do poetry over ages and no other purpose. So I hope you all understood it. If you all liked it and had benefited from it, please give it a thumbs up and do watch all other videos of mine wherein we are going to do a lot of poetries ahead. Thank you so much.